The stagecoach rattled to a stop outside the small wooden depot in Dillon, Montana, and Ethan Crawford stood frozen on the dusty Main Street, staring at the woman who descended with her carpet bag clutched between trembling hands. The autumn wind of 1885 swept through the valley, carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains, but Ethan couldn't smell anything except the sudden rush of memories that hit him like a stampede. Those eyes, that face. 20 years had passed, but he would know her anywhere. Sarah. The name fell from his lips before he could stop it, spoken like a prayer and a question all at once. The woman's head snapped up, her bonnet slipping back to reveal honey-colored hair streaked with strands of premature silver. Her green eyes widened, and the color drained from her face as recognition dawned. The carpetbag slipped from her fingers and hit the ground with a thud that seemed to echo in the sudden silence between them. Ethan. She whispered his name like she was seeing a ghost. Around them, Dillon carried on with its late afternoon business. Miners fresh from the silver claims trudged toward the saloons. A wagon loaded with timber creaked past. Someone hammered at the blacksmith's forge, but Ethan Crawford couldn't hear any of it. His mind was spinning backward through 2 decades to a different time, when he'd been a boy of 12 and Sarah had been the 10-year-old daughter of the schoolteacher, before her family had packed up one night and disappeared without a word or a backward glance. "What are you doing here?" He finally managed, his voice rough. Sarah opened her mouth, closed it, then bent to retrieve her bag with shaking hands. When she straightened, there was something almost defiant in the lift of her chin despite the moisture gathering in her eyes. "I'm here to meet my husband. Or rather, my husband-to-be. I answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride, and I was told to come to Dillon, Montana, to meet Mr. Ethan Crawford." The words hit him like a physical blow. For 3 months, he'd been corresponding with a woman named Nora Thompson from St. Louis. Her letters had been warm and thoughtful, painting a picture of a kind woman seeking a fresh start and a good man to build a life with. He'd sent her his last letter 6 weeks ago, along with money for the stagecoach fare, and had been waiting anxiously for her arrival. He'd imagined this meeting 1,000 times. None of those imaginings had included this. "Nora Thompson," he said slowly. "You said your name was Nora Thompson." Something flickered across her face, guilt and sadness and a dozen other emotions he couldn't quite read. "Thompson was my married name. I was widowed 3 years ago, and Nora is my middle name, Sarah Nora Thompson. You didn't think to mention you were from Dillon, that you knew me." "I didn't know it was you." Her voice cracked slightly. "The advertisement just said E. Crawford, rancher, Dillon, Montana. I thought perhaps it was your father, or maybe there was another Crawford family. Dillon isn't so small that there couldn't be more than one family with that name. And I never knew you'd stayed here. After my family left, I thought everyone would have scattered by now." Ethan ran a hand through his dark hair, his hat forgotten in his other hand. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of this impossible situation. "Your family left in the middle of the night. No warning. No goodbye. One day you were here and the next day your house was empty." Sarah's face went pale again and she looked away toward the mountains that ringed the valley. "My father had his reasons." "What reasons? We were friends, Sarah. You were my best friend and you just vanished." "I was 10 years old, Ethan. I didn't have a choice." There was real pain in her voice now, an old wound being reopened. "And we were children. Did you really think about me after a few months had passed?" The question hung in the air between them. Ethan wanted to say no, wanted to pretend that she was right and he'd forgotten her quickly. But that would have been a lie. He'd thought about Sarah more times than he could count over the years, wondered where she'd gone and why, wondered if she was happy, wondered if she ever thought about him. "Every day," he said quietly. For years, I thought about you every single day." Something in Sarah's expression crumbled. She pressed a hand to her mouth, and for a moment he thought she might cry, but she pulled herself together with visible effort, squaring her shoulders. "Well, this is quite the situation we've found ourselves in. That's one way to put it." They stood there in the dusty street. Two strangers who had once known each other as well as children could know anyone, separated by 20 years, and a canyon of unanswered questions. Ethan knew he should say something more, make some kind of decision about what happened next, but his thoughts were a tangled mess. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "I understand if you don't want to honor the arrangement. I can take the next stage east. It might be a few days, but I have enough money to stay at the boarding house until then. I won't hold you to any promise made to someone you thought was a stranger." "No." The word came out harder than he'd intended, and Sarah flinched slightly. Ethan softened his tone. "I mean, no, don't leave." "Not yet. Let me think for a minute." But thinking was difficult when his heart was pounding and his palms were sweating like he was a boy again. This was Sarah. His Sarah. Except she wasn't his Sarah anymore. She was a grown woman, a widow, someone who had lived an entire life he knew nothing about. And he was supposed to marry her in a week, according to the plans they'd made through letters. A buckboard rolled past, and Ethan suddenly became aware of the attention they were drawing. Mrs. Henderson was watching from the doorway of the general store with undisguised curiosity. Tom Miller had stopped loading his wagon to stare. By sundown, the whole town would be talking about Ethan Crawford and the strange reunion in the middle of Main Street. "Come on," Ethan said, reaching for Sarah's carpetbag. "Let's get you somewhere more private. We can talk at my ranch. It's about 3 miles outside of town." Sarah hesitated, and he could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "Is that proper?" "I've got a housekeeper, Mrs. Chen. She'll be there. And if you're supposed to be my bride, people will think it's stranger if I don't take you home." He managed a small, rueful smile. Besides, when have either of us cared much about propriety? That earned him a ghost of a smile in return. "You remember that?" "I remember everything." The words came out more intense than he'd meant them, and Sarah's breath caught. Ethan cleared his throat and gestured toward where his horse and wagon waited at the hitching post. "Come on. We've got a lot to talk about." The ride out to the Crawford ranch was mostly silent. Sarah sat stiffly on the wagon seat beside Ethan, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the rutted road ahead. The valley spread around them in shades of gold and amber, autumn painting the cottonwoods along the creek in brilliant yellows. The mountains rose on either side, already wearing caps of early snow on their highest peaks. "It's beautiful," Sarah said softly, breaking the silence. "I'd forgotten how beautiful it was here." "Best land in Montana," Ethan said, falling into the familiar cadence of talking about his ranch. It was easier than talking about the past. "Got good water from Rattlesnake Creek, plenty of grass for the cattle. The winters are hard, but we manage. You said in your letters that you have 200 head of cattle. 230 now. Had a good season for calving." He glanced at her from the corner of his eye. "You said in your letters that you liked to read, that you helped run a boarding house in St. Louis." "I did. After my husband died, I needed work. The boarding house owner, Mrs. Fletcher, took me in. She taught me how to manage the books, how to deal with difficult boarders, how to make a home for people far from their own families." Sarah's voice was wistful. "She was kind to me, but she passed away last spring and her son sold the property. I found myself alone again, and I thought perhaps it was time for a real change, a new beginning. Why Dillon? There must have been advertisements from men all over the West." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible over the rattle of the wagon wheels. I suppose part of me wanted to come home. Even if I didn't know it was your advertisement, I saw Dillon, Montana, and something in my heart pulled toward it. Is that foolish? No, Ethan said quietly. That's not foolish at all. They fell into silence again, but it felt slightly less strained than before. The wagon crested a small rise, and Ethan's ranch spread out before them in the valley below. The main house was built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around two sides. A barn stood off to the left, freshly painted red, and a series of corrals held the horses and a few head of cattle. Smoke rose from the chimney, a welcoming sign in the cooling autumn air. "This is yours?" Sarah asked, and there was genuine surprise in her voice. "Built it myself over the last 8 years. Well, I had help with the barn and the addition on the house, but the original cabin was all mine." There was pride in Ethan's voice, and he couldn't help it. He'd worked hard for every board and nail in this place. "It's not fancy, but it's home." "It's wonderful," Sarah said, and she sounded like she meant it. As they pulled up to the house, the front door opened and a small, sturdy woman in her 50s stepped out onto the porch. Mrs. Chen wiped her hands on her apron and squinted at the wagon with open curiosity. She'd come to Montana from San Francisco 5 years ago with her late husband, seeking their fortune in the silver mines. After his death in a cave-in, Ethan had hired her to help manage the house, and she'd proven to be worth her weight in gold. "You're back early," Mrs. Chen called. "This must be the bride. Mrs. Chen, this is Sarah Thompson. Sarah, this is my housekeeper, Mrs. Chen." Sarah climbed down from the wagon with as much grace as she could manage, smoothing her travel-worn skirts. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Chen." The older woman's sharp eyes traveled from Sarah to Ethan and back again, taking in the tension that crackled between them. "Well, come inside, both of you. I've got coffee on and dinner will be ready in an hour. You look like you could use both." The house was warm and smelled of fresh bread, and something savory bubbling on the stove. The main room was simply furnished but comfortable, with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall and sturdy furniture that looked handmade. Books lined a shelf near the window, and Sarah's eyes went to them immediately. "The guest room is ready," Mrs. Chen said, gesturing toward a hallway that led off the main room. "I prepared it this morning, thinking your bride would be arriving. I'll show you where to put your things, Miss Thompson." "Thank you," Sarah said softly. She followed Mrs. Chen down the hallway, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts for the first time since the stagecoach had arrived. He sank into his favorite chair and let his head fall back against the wooden frame. What was he supposed to do now? He'd been prepared to meet a stranger, to court her gently and carefully until they both felt comfortable enough to marry. He'd been prepared to build something new with someone who had no history with him, no expectations or memories. But Sarah wasn't a stranger. She was the girl who'd taught him how to catch frogs in the creek, who'd shared her lunch with him when his father forgot to pack one, who'd read him stories from her father's books in the shade of the old oak tree that used to stand behind the schoolhouse. She was his first friend, maybe his best friend, and she'd disappeared without a trace, and now she was supposed to be his wife. Mrs. Chen returned from the hallway alone, fixing Ethan with a knowing look. "You want to tell me what's really going on? That girl looks like she's seen a ghost, and you don't look much better." Ethan ran his hands over his face. "She's from here, from Dillon. We knew each other when we were children before her family left town 20 years ago. I had no idea the woman I'd been writing to was her." Mrs. Chen let out a low whistle. "That's quite the coincidence." "Is it? I don't know what to think, Mrs. Chen. Part of me wonders if she knew it was me all along." "Did you ask her?" "She says she didn't know, that she thought it might be my father or another Crawford family." "Do you believe her?" Ethan thought about the shock on Sarah's face when she'd first seen him, the way all the color had drained from her cheeks. "Yes, I believe her." "Then what's the problem?" "The problem is that I don't know this woman. I knew a little girl 20 years ago, but people change. What if we're nothing like we were? What if she's disappointed? What if I'm disappointed?" Mrs. Chen settled into the chair across from him, her expression gentle but firm. "Mr. Crawford, you were planning to marry a complete stranger a week from now. At least with this woman, you have some shared history, some foundation to build on. And from the way you've been talking about her since you got home, I'd say you care about her more than you're willing to admit." Before Ethan could respond, Sarah emerged from the hallway. She'd removed her bonnet and tidied her hair, but she still looked exhausted and uncertain. Her eyes met Ethan's, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "We should talk, properly I mean, about everything." "You're right," Ethan said, standing. He glanced at Mrs. Chen. "Would you give us some privacy?" "I'll be in the kitchen if you need me," Mrs. Chen said, rising with a pointed look at both of them. "Try to be kind to each other. Life's too short for anything else." After she left, Ethan gestured for Sarah to sit. She chose the chair Mrs. Chen had vacated, perching on the edge like she might need to flee at any moment. Ethan remained standing, too restless to sit. "Why did your family leave?" The question came out more abruptly than he'd intended, but it had been burning in him for 20 years. "Everyone said your father left debts behind, that he was running from something." Sarah's hands twisted in her lap. "The debts were real. My father made some bad investments, trusted the wrong people. He was going to lose everything, including his position as schoolteacher. He thought if we left in the night, we could start over somewhere fresh without the shame following us." "Where did you go?" "Denver first, then Kansas City, then St. Louis. My father never could stay in one place for long. He always thought the next town would be better, that his luck would change." Her voice was bitter now. "It never did. He drank away what little money we had, and my mother took in sewing to keep us fed. When I was 16, she got sick, pneumonia. We couldn't afford a doctor." "Sarah," Ethan said softly, his anger melting into sympathy, "I'm sorry. After she died, my father just gave up. He drank himself to death within a year. I was 17, alone in St. Louis with no family and no money." She looked up at him, and there was such pain in her eyes that it made his chest ache. "A man named George Thompson offered to marry me. He was twice my age but kind enough. He provided for me, gave me a home. I can't say I loved him, but I was grateful to him. When he died of a heart ailment 3 years ago, he left me with enough money to live on for a while. But it was running out, and I was tired of being alone. So you answered my advertisement." "I answered several advertisements," Sarah admitted, "but yours was the one that felt right. You wrote about the mountains and the valley, about building something that would last. You sounded like someone who understood what it meant to put down roots, to make a real home. And then, when I saw it was Dillon, I thought perhaps it was fate." Ethan moved to the window, looking out at the land he'd worked so hard to claim as his own. "After your family left, my father started drinking too. He'd always been hard, but he got meaner. I left home when I was 16, worked on ranches all over Montana and Wyoming, saved every penny I could. When I was 24, I came back here and bought this land. I've been building ever since." "Why did you come back? To Dillon, I mean, if your father was here." "He'd died by then. Fell off his horse drunk and broke his neck." Ethan's voice was flat. "I came back because this was home. Because even with all the bad memories, there were good ones too. And most of those good memories involved a little girl with honey-colored hair who wasn't afraid of anything." Sarah made a small sound, and when Ethan turned, he saw tears tracking down her cheeks. "I was afraid of everything," she whispered. "I was terrified the night we left. I wanted to say goodbye to you, but my father wouldn't let me. He said we couldn't tell anyone where we were going. I looked for you. For months, I asked every traveler who came through town if they'd seen your family. I even tried to track you, but I was 12 years old and didn't get more than a day's ride before I had to turn back. You looked for me. Of course I did. You were my best friend, Sarah. You were the only person who made life in this town bearable. Sarah stood, crossing the distance between them until she stood just a few feet away. This close, Ethan could see the lines that time and hardship had etched around her eyes, could see the silver threading through her hair. But he could also see the girl he'd known, still there in the shape of her smile and the set of her jaw. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "The plan was to take a week to get to know each other before the wedding. Maybe we should stick to that plan. Use the time to become reacquainted, to see if the people we've become can build something together. And if we can't, if we're too different now, then I'll make sure you have enough money to start over somewhere else. I won't force you into anything, Sarah. You have my word on that." She studied his face for a long moment, and something in her expression softened. "You grew up to be a good man, Ethan Crawford. I'm glad of that. You grew up to be a strong woman. I'm sorry it was such a hard path to get there." A small smile touched Sarah's lips, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "We're quite the pair, aren't we? Two people shaped by hard lives, trying to figure out if we can make something soft and good together." "I think we can," Ethan heard himself say. "I'd like to try at least." "So would I." Mrs. Chen called them to dinner shortly after, and the three of them sat around the sturdy wooden table while she served up a hearty stew and fresh bread. The conversation was lighter over the meal, touching on safer subjects like the ranch operation, the town's growth since Sarah had left, and Mrs. Chen's colorful stories about the boarding house she'd run in San Francisco before coming to Montana. After dinner, Ethan excused himself to check on the horses, leaving Sarah to help Mrs. Chen with the dishes despite the older woman's protests that a guest shouldn't work. Through the kitchen window, Mrs. Chen watched Ethan's silhouette moving through the barn, his lantern casting long shadows. "He's a good man," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "Treats his workers fair, never raises his voice unless the situation demands it. But he's been lonely. This ranch is beautiful, but it's been missing something." "A wife," Sarah said, scrubbing at a plate. "A partner," Mrs. Chen corrected. "Someone to share the burden and the joy of it all. He works himself too hard because there's no reason to stop working, no one waiting for him inside. I've been hoping the mail-order bride arrangement would work out, but I'll admit I had my concerns. Hard to know someone from letters alone. And now that you know I'm not a stranger," Mrs. Chen turned to face her fully. "Now I'm wondering if perhaps God or fate or whatever you want to call it had a hand in bringing you back here. You two have a chance to rewrite old stories, to take the friendship you had as children and build something more. That's rarer than you might think." Sarah set down the plate, her hands trembling slightly. "What if I'm not what he needs? What if I disappoint him? What if you're exactly what he needs and he's exactly what you need? You could spend your whole life being afraid of what might go wrong, or you could take a chance on what might go right." Mrs. Chen patted her arm kindly. "Besides, I've seen the way he looks at you. That's not the look of a man who's disappointed." That night, Sarah lay awake in the guest room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her. The wind whispered through the eaves, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the moon. The bed was comfortable, far more so than the narrow cot she'd had at the boarding house, and Mrs. Chen had left a warm quilt folded at the foot in case the night turned cold. But despite the comfort, sleep eluded her. Her mind kept replaying the moment when Ethan had said her name, the shock and recognition in his eyes. She'd spent the entire journey from St. Louis imagining this meeting, building up a picture in her mind of the stranger she'd marry. Never in her wildest imaginings had she thought it would be Ethan. Ethan, who taught her how to skip stones across the creek. Ethan, who defended her from the older boys who teased her about her hand-me-down dresses. Ethan, who'd listened to her dreams of seeing the ocean someday and promised they'd go together when they grew up. That promise had been broken along with so many others the night her family fled Dillon. She'd cried herself to sleep for weeks, mourning the loss of her friend and the only home she'd ever known. Eventually, the tears had dried up, replaced by the hard necessity of survival. There'd been no room for childish dreams in the life that followed. But now, lying in this comfortable bed in Ethan's house, those old dreams stirred again. What if this was her chance? What if they really could take the foundation of their childhood friendship and build something lasting and true? The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Down the hall, Ethan was having similar thoughts as he stared at the ceiling of his own room. He'd imagined this week so many times, planned how he'd court his mail-order bride with quiet walks and careful conversations. He'd wanted to build trust slowly, to show her that he was a good man worth taking a chance on. But Sarah already knew him, at least the boy he'd been. And he'd known her, the brave little girl who'd faced down bullies and climbed trees and read stories with a passion that made his heart soar. The question now was whether the adults they'd become could connect the same way. He wanted to try. God help him, but he wanted it more than he'd wanted anything in a long time. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with frost painting the grass silver. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and when she emerged from her room dressed in one of her simpler day dresses, she found Mrs. Chen already preparing breakfast and Ethan nowhere in sight. "He's out tending the stock," Mrs. Chen explained, sliding eggs onto a plate. "He'll be back in about an hour. Eats enough breakfast for 3 men after morning chores. Can I help with anything? You can eat and keep me company. There's plenty of time for you to learn the routine of this place if things work out the way they should." Sarah accepted the plate gratefully and sat at the table. Through the window, she could see the mountains bathed in the early morning light, their peaks glowing gold and pink. "It really is beautiful here. I'd forgotten, or maybe I never fully appreciated it as a child." "Where we come from shapes us," Mrs. Chen said, pouring coffee into thick ceramic mugs. "But it's where we choose to stay that defines us. You chose to come back here, even if you didn't know exactly what you were coming back to. That says something." Before Sarah could respond, the door opened and Ethan entered in a rush of cold air and the smell of horses and hay. He stopped short when he saw Sarah at the table, as if he'd forgotten for a moment that she was there. Then a slow smile spread across his face. "Morning," he said, hanging his hat and coat on the pegs by the door. "Sleep well." "I did, thank you. The room is lovely." "Good, good." He moved to wash his hands at the basin, suddenly seeming awkward. "I thought today, if you're feeling up to it, I could show you around the ranch properly. Let you see what life here would be like." "I'd like that very much." They ate breakfast together, Mrs. Chen keeping up a steady stream of chatter that filled the silences when Sarah and Ethan didn't know what to say to each other. Afterward, Ethan saddled 2 horses while Sarah changed into a more practical skirt and borrowed a warm coat from Mrs. Chen. The morning air was crisp and clean as they rode out from the ranch buildings. Ethan kept his horse to a gentle walk, pointing out the boundaries of his property and explaining his plans for expanding the herd next spring. Sarah listened, asking questions that showed she was genuinely interested, and slowly the awkwardness between them began to ease. "That ridge there," Ethan said, pointing to a rocky outcrop about a mile distant. That's where the creek starts, fed by snowmelt. The water runs year-round, which is why this land is so valuable. Even in a dry summer, we've got reliable water. How many acres do you have? About 800 now. Started with 200, but I've been able to buy up adjacent parcels as they became available. It's enough for the herd I want to maintain and room to grow if needed. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, following the creek as it wound through the valley. The cottonwoods along its banks were brilliant gold, their leaves shimmering in the breeze. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals up toward the mountains. "There's something I need to know," Sarah said suddenly, breaking the silence. "In your letters, you wrote about wanting a partner, someone to share your life with. Was that true, or was it just pretty words to attract a bride?" Ethan reined in his horse and turned to face her fully. "It was true. Every word I wrote you was true, Sarah. I'm 32 years old, and I've spent the last 8 years building this ranch into something I'm proud of. But it's been lonely. I eat dinner alone, sleep alone, make decisions alone. I wanted someone to come home to, someone to talk to about my day, someone to build a future with. Not just someone to cook and clean and bear children. Mrs. Chen does the cooking and cleaning just fine. And as for children..." He paused, his expression growing serious. "Yes, I'd like children someday if we're blessed with them. But I want them to come from a partnership built on respect and affection, not just obligation." Sarah's eyes searched his face. "You really mean that?" "I do. I want what my parents never had. I want a marriage based on choice and care, not just necessity. Is that what you want too?" "Yes," Sarah said softly. "My marriage to George was kind enough, but it was a business arrangement more than anything. He needed someone to manage his household, and I needed security. We were fond of each other, but there was no passion, no real connection. I always wondered what it would be like to marry someone I actually loved." "Then let's find out," Ethan said. "Let's take this week and see if we can find that connection. No obligations, no pressure, just two people getting to know each other again. I'd like that." They continued their ride, and as the morning wore on, conversation came more easily. They traded stories from their years apart, filling in the gaps of 2 decades. Sarah told him about her mother's quiet strength in the face of poverty, about the books she'd read that had sustained her through difficult times, about the friends she'd made at the boarding house who'd become like family. Ethan talked about his years working on other ranches, learning everything he could about cattle and horses and land management. He told her about buying his first 10 head of cattle, about the pride he'd felt watching his herd grow. He talked about the winters that had nearly broken him and the summers that had restored his faith. "You ever wonder what your life would have been like if we'd stayed?" Sarah asked as they paused to let the horses drink from the creek. "If my family had never left?" "All the time when I was younger. I used to imagine that we'd have grown up together, maybe gotten married eventually, childish fantasies." "Were they?" Sarah's voice was quiet. "Childish, I mean. We were close, Ethan. Even as children, we understood each other in a way I've rarely found with anyone since." Ethan dismounted and came to help Sarah down from her horse, his hands gentle on her waist. They stood close together, so close she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. "No," he said finally. "They weren't childish. They were the dreams of a boy who'd found something rare and precious and lost it, and now, by some miracle, I've found it again. We're not the same people we were, Ethan. No, but maybe that's all right. Maybe the people we've become can be even better together than the children we were." Sarah reached up tentatively and touched his cheek, her fingers trembling slightly. "I want to believe that." "Then believe it," Ethan said, covering her hand with his own. "We have a week to figure this out. Let's not waste it being afraid." He was right. Fear had ruled too much of Sarah's life already. She'd been afraid when her family fled in the night, afraid during the hard years that followed, afraid when her mother died and then her father. She'd married George out of fear of being alone, and she'd answered Ethan's advertisement out of fear that her money would run out and she'd have nowhere to go. But standing here with Ethan, his hand warm over hers and his eyes full of hope and possibility, Sarah made a decision. She would choose courage this time. She would choose to believe that this second chance was a gift not to be squandered. "Show me the rest of the ranch," she said with a smile. "I want to see everything." They spent the rest of the morning exploring, Ethan showing Sarah every corner of the property he loved. They visited the north pasture where the main herd grazed, the small grove of aspens where he liked to sit and think, the ridge that offered a view of the entire valley spread out below. Everywhere they went, Ethan talked about his plans and dreams, and Sarah found herself getting caught up in his vision. By the time they returned to the house for lunch, Sarah's cheeks were flushed from the cold air and exercise, and she was laughing at a story Ethan had told about a particularly stubborn bull. Mrs. Chen took one look at them and smiled to herself, humming as she ladled soup into bowls. The afternoon was spent in quieter pursuits. While Ethan worked on repairing some tack in the barn, Sarah sat in the main room with Mrs. Chen, learning to mend the work shirts that Ethan seemed to tear with alarming regularity. They talked about everything and nothing, and Sarah felt herself relaxing into the rhythm of the ranch in a way she hadn't expected. That evening, after another hearty dinner, Ethan suggested they sit on the porch despite the cold. He built up the fire in the outdoor fire pit he'd constructed from river stones, and they sat wrapped in blankets, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "I used to look at these same stars," Sarah said softly, "and wonder if you were looking at them too, if you remembered me." "I remembered," Ethan said. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. When you left, it broke something in me. I was just a boy, and I didn't understand why you'd gone without even saying goodbye. For a long time, I blamed you. I thought maybe our friendship hadn't meant as much to you as it had to me." "It meant everything to me," Sarah said fiercely. "You were the best thing about my childhood, Ethan. Losing you was almost as hard as losing my mother. I know that now. And I want you to know that I'm not that hurt boy anymore. I've learned that life is complicated, that people make choices for reasons we can't always understand. I don't blame you or your father for leaving. I just regret all the years we lost. We can't get those years back." "No, but we can make the most of the years ahead." He turned to face her, his expression earnest in the firelight. "I know we've only just found each other again, but Sarah, I need you to know that I'm already certain. I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you. If you need more time to be sure, I'll give you that time. If you need me to court you properly, I'll do that too. But my heart is already decided." Sarah's breath caught. She'd been married before, but George had never spoken to her with this kind of raw honesty. Their arrangement had been practical, polite, but never passionate. What Ethan was offering was something entirely different. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "I'm afraid that this is too good to be true, that something will go wrong. My life has taught me not to trust happiness. Mine too. But maybe we can learn together to trust it, to build something strong enough that it can weather whatever storms come." He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "I'm not saying it will be easy. Ranch life is hard and marriage is hard. But I think we're both strong enough to handle it. Together." Sarah looked down at their joined hands, at the calluses on his fingers that matched the ones on her own. They were both people shaped by hard work and harder losses. But they were also both people who'd survived, who'd found their way back to each other against all odds. "Ask me in 3 days," she said finally. "Give me 3 more days to be sure and then ask me properly." "I can do that," Ethan said, though his smile suggested he knew what her answer would be. They sat together by the fire until the cold drove them inside, talking about everything and nothing, rebuilding the easy companionship they'd once shared. When they finally said goodnight and went to their separate rooms, both of them lay awake for a long time, thinking about the future that was beginning to take shape between them. The next day brought rain, a cold autumn downpour that drummed on the roof and turned the yard to mud. Ethan spent the morning in the barn tending to tasks that couldn't wait, while Sarah helped Mrs. Chen with indoor chores. They baked bread together, the kitchen warm and fragrant with yeast and flour, and Sarah found herself enjoying the simple domesticity of it. "You're a natural at this, Mrs. Chen observed, watching Sarah knead dough with practiced hands. "I was worried you might be too fine for ranch life, but I can see you've got a practical side." "I learned young that survival meant being willing to work," Sarah said. "There's no task too humble if it needs doing." "That's the right attitude for this life. It's beautiful here, but it's not easy. The winters are brutal and there's always something that needs fixing or tending. You need to be tough to make it." "I am tough," Sarah said with quiet confidence. "Life has made sure of that." When Ethan came in for lunch, dripping wet and tracking mud despite his best efforts to wipe his boots, Sarah laughed at his sheepish expression. "Go get changed. I'll clean this up. You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to. I want to." She shooed him toward his room with a smile. "Go on. You'll catch your death standing there soaking wet." After lunch, the 3 of them sat around the fire while the rain continued outside. Ethan had a book of poetry he'd been working through, and he read aloud while Sarah and Mrs. Chen worked on mending. His voice was deep and steady, and Sarah found herself watching him more than she listened to the words. He'd grown into a handsome man, she thought. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a quiet strength that showed in everything he did. His face bore the marks of years spent working outdoors, lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, and a few scars from accidents and hard labor. But there was kindness in his eyes and gentleness in his hands when he helped her with small tasks. More than his appearance, though, it was his character that drew her. He treated Mrs. Chen with respect and genuine affection. He spoke about his ranch hands with concern for their well-being. He talked about his dreams not with arrogance, but with the quiet determination of someone who understood that good things required hard work and patience. This was a man worth taking a chance on. That evening, after Mrs. Chen had retired to her small cottage behind the main house, Sarah and Ethan found themselves alone by the fire. The rain had stopped, but the night was damp and cool and neither of them felt like venturing outside. "Tell me about George," Ethan said suddenly. "Your husband, what was he like?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "He was a good man, honest and hardworking. He ran a small printing business and he took pride in his work. He was kind to me, never raised his voice or his hand. But he was also much older than me, set in his ways. We lived parallel lives more than we lived together, if that makes sense. Did you love him?" "I cared for him deeply and was grateful to him. But no, I didn't love him the way a woman should love her husband. I was 17 and desperate when we married. Love seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford. And now," Sarah met his eyes, "now I want more. I want what I've been reading about in books all these years. I want passion and partnership and a love that makes all the hard days worthwhile." Ethan moved from his chair to sit beside her on the couch, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I want that too. I've been alone so long, Sarah. I want someone to wake up beside, someone to share my troubles and my triumphs with." I want to build something that lasts, not just a ranch but a real home full of life and love. Children, if we're blessed with them, yes. But even if we're not, I'll count myself lucky to have you." Sarah turned to face him fully. "You're a good man, Ethan Crawford." "Better than I deserve, probably." "Don't say that. You deserve every happiness, Sarah. Life has been hard enough on you." They sat together in the firelight, talking late into the night about their hopes and fears. Ethan told her about his worries that he wasn't educated enough, that his rough ways might embarrass her. Sarah confessed her fear that she wasn't strong enough for ranch life, that she'd fail him when he needed her most. They each reassured the other, building bridges of trust and understanding with every word. When they finally said goodnight, Ethan took Sarah's hand and lifted it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "2 more days," he said softly, "and then I'm asking you properly." "2 more days," Sarah agreed, her heart fluttering at the warmth in his eyes. The 3rd day dawned clear and bright, the storm having swept through and left everything washed clean. Ethan announced at breakfast that he needed to ride into town for supplies, and he asked if Sarah would like to come along. She agreed eagerly, curious to see how the town had changed since her childhood. The ride into Dillon was pleasant, the autumn sun warm on their backs. As they approached the town, Sarah could see how much it had grown. New buildings lined Main Street, and there were more people bustling about than she remembered from her childhood. "The silver mines brought prosperity," Ethan explained as they passed a particularly grand new hotel. "The population has nearly tripled since you left. It's not the small town you remember anymore." They spent the morning visiting the general store, the feed and grain, and the bank. Everywhere they went, people greeted Ethan with respect and eyed Sarah with open curiosity. Word had obviously spread about the mail-order bride, and there were plenty of interested glances and whispered conversations. At the general store, they ran into Thomas Miller, a man Ethan's age who ran the livery stable. He shook Ethan's hand enthusiastically and tipped his hat to Sarah. "Heard you finally got yourself a bride, Crawford. About time. A man needs a good woman to make a house a home. Sarah, this is Tom Miller. Tom, this is Sarah Thompson, though she used to be Sarah Taylor when we were kids." Recognition dawned on Tom's face. "Little Sarah Taylor. Well, I'll be. I remember you. You used to climb trees better than any of the boys." Sarah laughed, pleased that someone else remembered. "I'm afraid I'm not quite as nimble these days, but it's good to see you again, Tom." They chatted for a few minutes before moving on, but the encounter lifted Sarah's spirits. Maybe coming back to Dillon wouldn't be so strange after all. Maybe she could find a place here, could become part of the community again. Their last stop was the small church at the edge of town. Reverend Patterson, an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle manner, welcomed them warmly. Ethan had written to him about the wedding, and the Reverend was eager to meet Sarah. "It's wonderful to meet you, my dear," he said, taking both of Sarah's hands in his. "Ethan has been a pillar of this community, and I'm delighted he's found someone to share his life with." They discussed plans for the ceremony, which would be simple but heartfelt. As they talked, Sarah found herself relaxing. This felt right. All of it felt right in a way nothing had felt right in a very long time. On the ride back to the ranch, Ethan was quiet, and Sarah wondered what he was thinking. Finally, she asked. "I was thinking about how strange fate is," he said. "All those years, all those miles that separated us, and here we are riding back to my ranch together like it was always meant to be." "Do you believe in fate?" "I didn't used to. I thought everything was just luck and hard work. But now, with you here, I can't help but think something bigger than us brought you back. Maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe it was fate. Either way, I'm glad I'm here." "So am I." That evening, Mrs. Chen prepared a special dinner to celebrate, as she put it, the almost end of Ethan's bachelorhood. She'd roasted a chicken and made all of Ethan's favorite side dishes, and they ate until they were stuffed, laughing and talking like old friends. After dinner, Ethan suggested a walk. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the valley, and the air was crisp but not too cold. They walked hand in hand down to the creek, following the path through the cottonwoods. "Tomorrow is the 4th day," Ethan said when they reached a small clearing by the water. "You asked me to give you 3 days. I did. Are you ready for me to ask you?" Sarah looked up at him, at his face in the moonlight, at the hope and tenderness in his eyes. She thought about the past 3 days, about how easily they'd fallen back into companionship, about how right it felt to be here with him. She thought about the life he was offering, the partnership and love and future they could build together. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm ready." Ethan took both of her hands in his grip firm but gentle. "Sarah Nora Thompson, I know our path to this moment has been strange and unexpected, but I believe with my whole heart that we were meant to find each other again. You're my dearest childhood friend, and I believe you could be so much more. Will you marry me? Will you be my partner and my wife and build a life here with me?" Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes, but they were happy tears this time. "Yes, Ethan Crawford. Yes, I'll marry you." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and Sarah felt like she was finally home. When he kissed her, gentle and sweet under the moonlight, it felt like a promise. A promise of better days ahead, of love that would grow and deepen with time, of a partnership built on respect and affection and shared history. They stood there by the creek for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, making quiet plans and promises. When they finally walked back to the house, their fingers were laced together and both of them were smiling. The next 3 days passed in a happy blur of preparation. Sarah and Mrs. Chen worked together to alter one of Sarah's better dresses for the wedding, adding lace and making small adjustments until it was perfect. Ethan rode into town to finalize arrangements with Reverend Patterson and to invite a few close friends to witness the ceremony. The night before the wedding, Sarah couldn't sleep. She stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the moonlit valley, and thought about how much her life was about to change. She was nervous but not afraid. What she felt was anticipation, excitement for the future she was about to begin. A soft knock at her door startled her. "Come in," she called softly. Mrs. Chen entered, carrying a shawl. "I thought you might be awake. It's a rare bride who sleeps well the night before her wedding." "I'm too excited to sleep." Mrs. Chen came to stand beside her at the window. "You're doing the right thing, you know. Ethan is a good man, and you two have something special. I've seen it in the way you look at each other, the way you move around each other like you've been together for years instead of days. We were friends long ago. Maybe that's what we're feeling, just an echo of what we once had. It's more than that, and you know it. You're falling in love with him, and he's falling in love with you. Don't be afraid of it, Sarah. Embrace it." Sarah turned to the older woman, seeing the wisdom in her eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen, for everything, for making me feel welcome here, for your kindness and your guidance. Thank you for making Ethan happy. That's all the payment I need." She kissed Sarah's cheek and headed for the door. "Now try to get some sleep. You'll want to look your best tomorrow." The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, one of those perfect autumn days when the sky is impossibly blue and the air is crisp and clean. Sarah dressed with Mrs. Chen's help, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the buttons on her altered dress. The pale blue fabric complemented her coloring, and Mrs. Chen had woven some late-blooming wildflowers into her hair. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Chen said, her voice thick with emotion. "Ethan is a lucky man." The ceremony was held at the small church, with about 24 people in attendance. Tom Miller was there, along with several of Ethan's ranch hands and a few of the neighboring ranchers and their wives. Reverend Patterson stood at the altar, beaming with joy. When Ethan saw Sarah walking down the aisle, his breath caught. She was lovely, moving toward him with grace and confidence, her eyes locked on his. He'd never seen anything more beautiful in his life. They stood together before the Reverend, hands clasped, and spoke their vows with voices that rang clear and true. When Ethan slipped a simple gold band onto Sarah's finger, she felt the weight of it like a promise made real. And when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and Ethan kissed her softly in front of their small gathering of friends, Sarah felt something in her heart settle and sing. They were married. They were home. The reception was held at the ranch, with Mrs. Chen having prepared enough food to feed twice the number of guests. There was music and laughter, and Sarah found herself swept into conversation after conversation with people welcoming her to the community. It was overwhelming but wonderful, and through it all, Ethan stayed close, his hand at her back or holding hers, a constant reassuring presence. As the sun began to set, and the guests started to take their leave, Tom Miller pulled Ethan aside for a private word. "You did good, Crawford. She's perfect for you. Anyone can see that you two belong together." "I'm a lucky man," Ethan agreed, watching Sarah across the yard as she laughed at something Mrs. Chen said. "Luck had nothing to do with it. That's fate right there, bringing your childhood sweetheart back to you after all these years. Don't take it for granted." "I won't. I promise you that." Finally, the last guest departed, and Mrs. Chen tactfully retreated to her cottage for the evening, leaving the newlyweds alone. The house was quiet except for the crackling of the fire Ethan had built in the fireplace. Sarah stood near the mantel, suddenly shy now that they were alone. Ethan crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Crawford?" "Mrs. Crawford," Sarah repeated, testing the name. "It sounds strange but wonderful. I'm feeling happy, Ethan. Happier than I've been in longer than I can remember." "Me too." He lifted one hand to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing gently across her skin. "I know this has all happened quickly. If you need time, if you're not ready for everything that comes with marriage, I can wait. I want you to be comfortable." Sarah covered his hand with hers, leaning into his touch. "I don't want to wait. I've waited long enough for happiness, for love. I want to start our life together, all of it, tonight." Ethan's eyes darkened with emotion. He kissed her then, deeper and more passionate than the chaste kiss they'd shared at the altar. Sarah responded eagerly, wrapping her arms around his neck and pressing close. This was what she'd longed for, this connection, this desire that made her feel alive and wanted. He lifted her into his arms, and she laughed in surprised delight as he carried her down the hall to his bedroom, which was now their bedroom. He set her down gently on the edge of the bed, and for a moment they just looked at each other in the soft lamplight. "I never thought I'd have this," Ethan said quietly. "A wife, a real marriage. You've given me something precious, Sarah. You've given me something precious, too. A home, a future, a love I never thought I'd find." They came together then with tenderness and growing passion, discovering each other slowly and sweetly. Outside, the moon rose over the mountains and the night wrapped around the ranch like a blessing. Inside, two people who'd been lost found each other at last, writing the first pages of their new story together. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. Sarah learned the routines of the ranch, rising early with Ethan to help with morning chores. She discovered that she enjoyed caring for the chickens Mrs. Chen kept in a coop behind the house, and she took over managing the kitchen garden that had been somewhat neglected. Mrs. Chen taught her how to preserve food for winter, how to manage the household accounts, and how to deal with the various emergencies that could arise on a working ranch. Sarah proved to be a quick learner, and soon she was handling many of these tasks independently. But more than just learning the practical skills of ranch life, Sarah was learning how to be married to Ethan. They talked over breakfast about their plans for the day. They worked side by side on tasks that needed two pairs of hands. In the evenings, they sat together by the fire, sometimes reading aloud to each other, sometimes just enjoying quiet companionship. And at night, in the privacy of their bedroom, they learned each other in the most intimate ways, their passion growing as their comfort with each other deepened. Sarah had never known that marriage could be like this, that physical intimacy could be both tender and thrilling, that she could feel so desired and cherished. One morning about 2 weeks after the wedding, Sarah woke to find Ethan already dressed and standing by the window, looking out at the first real snowfall of the season. She slipped out of bed and came to stand beside him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. "It's beautiful," she said, watching the fat flakes drift down. "It's also a reminder that winter is coming. We've got about another month of mild weather and then it's going to get harsh." He turned in her embrace to face her. "Are you ready for that? Montana winters are brutal, Sarah. We might get snowed in for days at a time. It can be isolating. As long as I'm with you, I'm ready for anything." He kissed her forehead, pulling her close. "I love you. I don't think I've said that enough. I love you, Sarah. I loved the girl you were, and I love the woman you've become." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind. "I love you too, Ethan. I think maybe I've been falling in love with you since the moment I stepped off that stagecoach and heard you say my name." They stood together watching the snow, wrapped in each other's arms, and Sarah thought about how far she'd come. From a frightened child fleeing in the night, to a struggling orphan, to an unhappy bride married out of necessity, to this, finally. A woman in love with her husband, building a life that was truly her own. The winter did indeed prove harsh, just as Ethan had warned. By December, snow lay thick on the ground and the temperatures plummeted. There were days when the wind howled so fiercely that they couldn't leave the house, when they had to tunnel paths through drifts just to reach the barn. But Sarah found that she didn't mind. The house was warm and cozy, and she and Ethan and Mrs. Chen became their own small family, weathering the storms together. They played cards on the long evenings, and Sarah taught Ethan to knit, which he grumbled about but secretly seemed to enjoy. They read through every book in the house and then read them again. Christmas came, and they celebrated quietly with a small tree that Ethan cut from the property, and a feast that Mrs. Chen prepared with Sarah's help. Ethan gave Sarah a beautiful shawl he'd ordered from a catalog, deep blue wool with silver embroidery. Sarah gave him a new pair of gloves she'd knitted herself, lined with soft rabbit fur. But the best gift came in late January, when Sarah realized her monthly courses were late. She waited another 2 weeks to be sure before telling Ethan, and when she finally did, his face lit up with such joy that it brought tears to her eyes. "A baby," he repeated, gathering her into his arms. "We're going to have a baby, we are. Sometime in early September, if I've calculated correctly." Ethan whooped with delight, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to stop. "We're going to be parents, Sarah. We're going to have a family." That night, lying in bed with his hand resting protectively on her still flat belly, Ethan talked about his dreams for their child. He wanted to be nothing like his own father had been. He wanted to be kind and patient, to make their child feel loved and safe. Sarah listened, her heart full, knowing that Ethan would be exactly the father he dreamed of being. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the late winter and into spring. As the snow melted and the valley burst into bloom, Sarah bloomed too, her belly growing round and firm. She continued to work around the ranch as much as she could, though Ethan fretted about her overdoing it. "I'm pregnant, not fragile," she told him one warm May afternoon when he'd caught her hanging laundry. "Women have been having babies while working for thousands of years. You're not just any woman, you're my wife, and I worry." "Worry less and help me hang these sheets," Sarah said with a smile. "That would be more useful." By midsummer, Sarah was very pregnant and quite uncomfortable in the heat. She spent most afternoons in the shade of the porch, shelling peas or mending while Mrs. Chen kept her company. They'd become close friends over the winter, and Sarah was grateful for the older woman's wisdom and experience. "You think I'll be a good mother?" Sarah asked one afternoon, watching Ethan work with the horses in the corral. "I think you'll be wonderful," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "You have love to give and patience and strength. That's all any child really needs. What if I'm like my father? What if I fail them the way he failed me?" "Your father made his choices, and they were not good ones. But you are not your father, Sarah. You're stronger than he was, and you have Ethan beside you. This child will be loved and cherished, and that's what matters." The baby came on a hot September afternoon, arriving a week earlier than expected. Ethan rode frantically into town for the doctor, while Mrs. Chen stayed with Sarah, coaching her through the contractions with calm efficiency. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Sarah thought she couldn't do it, couldn't push through the pain. But then she heard it, the first sharp cry of her newborn baby, and every moment of pain was forgotten. Mrs. Chen placed the squalling infant on Sarah's chest, and Sarah looked down into the tiny red face with overwhelming love. "A boy," the doctor announced, cleaning up his instruments. "A healthy, strong boy." Ethan burst back into the room, having returned with the doctor, and froze at the sight before him. Sarah, exhausted but radiant, holding their son. He moved to the bed slowly, reverently, as if approaching something sacred. "We have a son," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "Ethan, we have a son." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, looking down at the tiny bundle. The baby had stopped crying and was staring up at them with unfocused dark eyes. Ethan reached out one finger, and the baby's tiny hand wrapped around it instinctively. "He's perfect," Ethan whispered. "He's absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" They discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had never quite decided. Now, looking at her son, Sarah knew exactly what his name should be. "James," she said. "James Crawford, after your father's father, the one you said was kind." Ethan looked at her in surprise. "You remembered that? I only mentioned it once." "I remember everything you tell me." She smiled tiredly. "So James, Ethan agreed. He leaned down to kiss Sarah's forehead, then placed a gentle kiss on his son's downy head. "Welcome to the world, James Crawford. We love you so much already." The weeks after James's birth were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feeding, of learning to care for a tiny, helpless human. Sarah was exhausted, her body recovering slowly from the birth, but she'd never been happier. Watching Ethan with their son, seeing the gentle way he held the baby and the wonder in his eyes, made her heart overflow with love. Mrs. Chen was a tremendous help, taking James for a few hours each day so Sarah could rest. But mostly, Sarah wanted him close, wanted to memorize every detail of his tiny face, every sound he made. She'd created this miracle, this perfect little person, with the man she loved. As autumn painted the valley in golds and reds again, James grew and thrived. He was a good baby, crying only when hungry or tired, and sleeping in longer stretches as the weeks passed. Sarah and Ethan settled into their new roles as parents, finding a rhythm that worked for their little family. One evening in late October, with James asleep in the cradle, Ethan had built beside their bed. Sarah and Ethan sat together on the porch wrapped in blankets against the chill. The first anniversary of Sarah's arrival in Dillon was approaching, and both of them were thinking about how much had changed in that year. A year ago, I was on a stagecoach heading toward what I thought would be a marriage to a stranger, Sarah said softly. I was terrified and hopeful in equal measure. I never imagined this. Neither did I. I thought I was getting a practical partner, someone to help run the ranch and keep me company. Instead, I got everything I'd ever dreamed of and more. Do you ever wish things had been different? That my family had never left, that we'd grown up together? Ethan considered the question carefully. Sometimes. But then I think about how the hard times shaped us, made us who we are. If things had been easy, maybe we wouldn't appreciate what we have now as much as we do. Maybe we needed to be broken a little so we could understand how precious it is to be whole together. Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder. When did you get so wise? Since I married you. You make me want to be better, to think deeper, to appreciate more. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. An owl hooted in the distance. The horses shifted in the barn. Inside, through the window, they could hear the soft breathing of their sleeping son. I want more, Sarah said suddenly. More children, I mean. If we're blessed with them, I want James to have siblings, to grow up in a house full of love and laughter. I want to fill this ranch with life. Ethan pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head. So do I. As many as God sees fit to give us. We'll raise them right, Sarah. We'll give them everything we didn't have. We'll give them love, Sarah said firmly. That's the most important thing. Everything else is just details. The years that followed proved Sarah's hope true. Over the next decade, 4 more children joined the Crawford family. A daughter they named Margaret arrived 2 years after James, followed by another son, William, 2 years after that. Then came twin girls, Emma and Clara, who kept everyone on their toes with their mischievous energy. The ranch grew along with the family. Ethan expanded the herd and bought more land, building a larger barn and adding rooms to the house to accommodate their growing brood. Sarah proved to be not just a capable ranch wife, but a sharp businesswoman, managing the accounts and helping Ethan make smart decisions about investments and expansions. Mrs. Chen remained with them through all of it, aging gracefully and becoming the beloved grandmother figure to the Crawford children. She taught them to speak a bit of Chinese, told them stories of San Francisco, and spoiled them just enough to make them feel special without becoming brats. Life wasn't always easy. There were harsh winters that killed livestock, droughts that dried up creeks, and accidents that required expensive doctors. William broke his arm falling from a horse when he was 6. Margaret suffered from terrible nightmares for a year after a close encounter with a mountain lion. The twins seemed determined to give Sarah gray hair with their constant schemes and adventures. But through all of it, Sarah and Ethan faced everything together, their love deepening with each challenge overcome. They still made time for each other, stealing moments alone when they could, still talking late into the night after the children were asleep. One evening in the late spring of 1897, 12 years after Sarah had stepped off that stagecoach, the family gathered on the now expanded porch for dinner. It was a tradition they'd started, eating outside when the weather was fine. Everyone crowded around the long table Ethan had built. James, now almost 12 and already showing signs of being as tall as his father, was talking animatedly about a book he'd read. Margaret, 10 and thoughtful, was sketching in the journal she carried everywhere. William, 8 and full of energy, was trying to convince his father to let him help with the cattle drive planned for next week. The twins, 6 years old and identical except for the different colored ribbons they wore in their hair, were giggling over some private joke. Sarah looked around at her family, at her husband at the head of the table with pride and love shining in his eyes, at their children healthy and happy and full of life, and felt such gratitude it brought tears to her eyes. "Mother, why are you crying?" Emma asked, noticing immediately. "I'm just happy," Sarah said, wiping at her eyes. "So very, very happy." Ethan reached across the table to take her hand, squeezing gently. No words were needed. He understood. They'd both traveled such long, hard roads to get to this moment, but it had all been worth it. After dinner, while the older children helped clear the table, and Mrs. Chen took the twins inside for their bath, Sarah and Ethan walked down to the creek, hand in hand as they'd done so many times over the years. The cottonwoods were in full leaf, and the evening light filtered through in dappled patterns. "You remember standing here the night I proposed?" Ethan asked. "Of course. You were so nervous your hands were shaking. I was terrified you'd say no." Sarah laughed. "I was terrified you'd realize you were making a mistake and take it back. Never, not for 1 second have I regretted marrying you, Sarah Crawford. Not even when the twins flooded the kitchen last month, not even then." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "You gave me everything I never knew I needed. A home full of love and laughter, children to carry on our legacy, and a partner who makes every day an adventure. You gave me the same. You saved me, Ethan. That day you said my name, recognized me. You saved my life in ways you'll never fully understand." "We saved each other," Ethan corrected gently. "That's what love does. It rescues and restores and rebuilds. We were both broken when we found each other again, and we made each other whole." They stood by the creek as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. In the distance, they could hear their children's laughter carrying on the evening breeze. The ranch sprawled around them, a testament to years of hard work and dedication. But more than the land or the cattle or the house, what they'd built was a family, a legacy of love that would endure. Sarah thought about the frightened young woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach 12 years ago, expecting to meet a stranger and instead finding her past and her future all at once. She thought about the scared little girl who'd fled Dillon in the night, certain she'd never be happy again. If she could go back and tell that girl that everything would work out, that all the pain and struggle would lead to this, she wondered if that younger self would believe it. Probably not. But that was all right. Some things had to be lived to be understood. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked, feeling her sigh against his chest. "About how grateful I am, about how lucky we are, about how I want to spend the rest of my life right here with you, watching our children grow and our grandchildren be born." "Grandchildren? Aren't we getting a bit ahead of ourselves?" "James is only 11, Sarah laughed. "Give it time. Before we know it, he'll be bringing home a girl who'll turn his world upside down just like I turned yours upside down." "You didn't turn my world upside down. You set it right side up again." They walked back to the house as the stars began to emerge, arms wrapped around each other. Inside, chaos reigned as usual. The twins were arguing over a toy. William was trying to convince Mrs. Chen to let him stay up late. Margaret was lost in her sketchbook, and James was reading by lamplight, already half lost in his imagination. This was their life. Messy, loud, exhausting, and absolutely perfect. The years continued to pass as years do. The children grew into capable, kind adults who made their parents proud. James took over the ranch operations, proving to be as skilled and dedicated as his father. Margaret married a teacher and moved to Butte, but visited often with her growing family. William became a veterinarian, using his love of animals to help ranchers throughout the region. The twins, inseparable as always, opened a dress shop in Dillon that became quite successful. Sarah and Ethan aged gracefully together, their hair turning silver, their movements slowing, but their love never wavering. They became grandparents 8 times over, and the ranch house was always full of visiting family, especially around holidays. Mrs. Chen passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by the family she'd come to love as her own. They buried her on a hill overlooking the valley, with a beautiful stone marker that read, "Beloved friend and honorary grandmother, your wisdom and love live on in the lives you touched." On their 30th wedding anniversary, Sarah and Ethan renewed their vows in the same little church where they'd first married. Their children and grandchildren filled the pews, and Reverend Patterson's successor performed the ceremony. When Ethan placed a new ring on Sarah's finger, upgrading the simple gold band she'd worn for 3 decades to something with a small diamond, she cried happy tears. 30 years, she said at the reception at the ranch. 30 years since I stepped off that stagecoach and you recognized me. Best decision I ever made coming to Dillon. Best thing that ever happened to me, Ethan agreed, was seeing your face that day. I knew immediately that my life was about to change. I just didn't know how much better it would become. As they danced together under the twilight sky, with their families celebrating around them, Sarah reflected on the incredible journey they'd taken together. From childhood friends to separated strangers to reunited lovers to partners in every sense of the word, they'd built something that would last far beyond their own lifetimes. The ranch would go to James and his family, but all of the children would share in the legacy. More importantly, they'd all learned what real love looked like from watching their parents. They'd learned about partnership and respect, about weathering storms together, about choosing each other every single day. That night, in their bedroom that had seen so much love and laughter over the years, Sarah and Ethan lay together in the darkness, holding hands like they always did. You ever think about what your life would have been like if you'd answered someone else's advertisement? Ethan asked. If fate hadn't brought you back to me. Never, Sarah said firmly. Because I don't believe fate would have let that happen. We were always meant to find our way back to each other, Ethan. From the moment we met as children, our stories were intertwined. 20 years apart didn't change that. I love you, Sarah Crawford. I've loved you for as long as I can remember, and I'll love you until my last breath. And I love you, Ethan Crawford. You're my home, my heart, my everything. They fell asleep holding each other, just as they'd done for 30 years, just as they'd continue to do for whatever years they had left. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the valley, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. The ranch stood strong under the moonlight, a testament to hard work and enduring love. Inside its walls, a family slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and cherished. And in the master bedroom, 2 people who'd found each other against all odds dreamed of the past they'd shared and the future still to come. This was their happily ever after, not perfect but perfectly theirs, built on a foundation of childhood friendship, adult love, and a shared commitment to building something that would last. From a chance reunion on a dusty street in Dillon, Montana, had sprung a love story for the ages, proof that sometimes the best endings are really just new beginnings in disguise. The mail-order bride had come home, and in coming home, she'd found everything she'd ever searched for: belonging, purpose, family, and a love that would endure through all the seasons of life. Sarah had left Dillon as a frightened child and returned as a hopeful woman. She would live out her days as a beloved wife, devoted mother, proud grandmother, and pillar of the community she'd once fled. And it all began with one word, spoken in shock and wonder on an autumn afternoon. Sarah. That single word had changed everything, had rewritten both their stories, had given them both a second chance at the happiness they'd lost so long ago. And they'd taken that chance and turned it into something beautiful, something lasting, something worth every struggle and hardship that had led them to that moment of reunion. This was love in its truest form, patient and kind, enduring all things, believing all things, hoping all things. This was the love that poets wrote about and singers sang of, the love that made all the difficult parts of life worthwhile. This was the love that Sarah and Ethan built together, day by day, year by year, until it became as much a part of the Montana landscape as the mountains and the valley and the creek that ran through their land. And long after they were gone, their descendants would tell the story of how great-grandmother Sarah came to Dillon as a mail-order bride, only to discover that her intended groom was her long-lost childhood friend. They'd tell it as a love story for the ages, as proof that true love can survive anything, even 20 years and 1,000 miles of separation. But Sarah and Ethan knew the truth was even better than the story. The truth was that love wasn't just something that happened to you. It was something you chose every single day. It was showing up for each other in the hard times and celebrating together in the good times. It was building something solid and lasting, brick by brick, moment by moment, choice by choice. And they'd chosen each other, then and now and always. That was the real miracle, the real happily ever after. Not that fate had brought them together, but that they'd both been brave enough to take the chance when it came, to risk their hearts one more time despite all the ways life had hurt them. The Crawford Ranch would stand for generations, a monument to their love and labor. But the real legacy Sarah and Ethan left behind wasn't the land or the house, or even the family name. It was the lesson they taught simply by living their lives together. That love is worth fighting for, that home is wherever your heart finds peace, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simple recognition of a familiar face in a crowd. Sarah. He'd said, and with that one word, both of their lives had begun again. And what a beautiful life it had been.